And yes, please, I think it's good time to say thank you and again express all my gratitude, and for the host plenary and all our guests here. What a significant time to be here together. And again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. And to begin our conversation, I'd really like to ask our elder here, Dr. Ren Freeman, to really build that connection, carry that message of what the host plenary brought forward and this continual idea of building partnerships with Indigenous nations.
Hidaka, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity, this gift to be with you, to have this conversation with each other and with all of you, to think about what has been shared with us from the very moment we opened as a conference, as a gathering, as a congress. There were stories. I was brought to tears with the amount of acknowledgement and sharing of culture from your lands and your peoples. And then to keep moving through that with the work we've been at together, the conversations with the host's plenary mob for many months. That's relationship building. That joins our stories. And so, as I was listening all along to our conversations over these months, and then especially what you had to share on your plenary and your conversation with all of us, there were a few things that stood out that just resonate, I think, if I can be so bold, throughout the world. Those of us who are indigenous to a land, and the land has created us in our peoples. What I heard from you and what I learned from you was we need to remember who we are, why we are. What does that mean? We heard from your esteemed fellows. We need to think about what we mean by indigenous and knowledges. And to use your word, does that require further critical awareness? Let's look at that. You used the word restructure. Is that what we do? I think we've been doing that. I hear that. I see that in our conversations. I've seen it in the sessions I've attended. And I think that's a good place to start. We're talking about beginnings. And yet also remembering. What should we be remembering right now? What is relevant? What is culturally sensitive? What is appropriate? And I think that's a really big issue we need to address. So what's the ethics and values that we come together with? What's our intentions? How do we make meaning together? How do we take care? I think listening to what Kirsten said in your plenary, there are 3 values that really spoke to you. There was responsibility, there was reciprocity, there was relationship. In the world of what is called indigenous knowing and the systems, we work with values and philosophies. Personally, I work with 8, and those are crafted from my Shoshonean worldview. And I work with those and try to understand and define them as I work with others. And that's what I heard from you. It's how you understand that, how you move with that, how you live your knowledge. To me, that's what our conversation is. And so moving into us being here, that bridge, that segue, that continuing story that we started, I see we've begun a practice of care, listening in the sessions, and Alvin, in your presentations, really planting the seeds. We need to think about, what does this look like when we say Indigenous knowledges and how we work together? It's not just philosophy, it's not just theory. You're looking at the practice of Indigenous knowledges. We're sitting here together, having a conversation, and you're here, listening, watching, and we have our ancestors with us. That's how we begin. This is what that means. This is what it looks like to practice our ways of knowing, being, and doing. How do we live this, I think, is our question. How do we move with it as we come together around topics and subjects like we're here for? How do we define sustainable space? How do we define resilient earth? We have a conversation, and we figure that out together for this time. Maybe different the next time. But that's what I've learned, and that's what resonates with me, and the messages that I feel, and that's the other part. What does this feel like? My mentor, a long time ago, who brought me into the sphere of what's called Indigenous research methodologies and methods, said, if you're not transformed, if you don't feel different, then maybe you need to keep working. And when we think about emerging space nations, let's take that as an example. How do we talk about that in terms of living, moving inside our conversation as a cultural way? I'd like to understand, Boo, what do you think about that? What are your thoughts?
Yat hen kedini de sano ten hon haiso kregim din le tron ke kushin stada se bit de mil sense trago hore shagalit ge head le la is hore khania do ne shlenege tratshi nin shle do nats os basis chin do khode chi ni das che do nats os da shnale hot o kada ze na kinde ze do se bi na kina khedo se bin de ze do de nebenant an shonshana nish beket khadesha arobelina ash inige hashklishnin le do shi yashin do no da tratshi ni da bche do bet ani da banala hot o stanen lo belina ash in do khalchene na ki laigana deep na kha do laigana na ki na kha hot in yesben yahoren khan yahagi dia yesdenen da alkha le yot da sonda den ido het all nas ko dol da to het all jono do le noye de hwa de nesahile standa to sost de mil hwa de nei kha noye hode trahon slodele als so hanet dan kitchen hode schlich hot o nasko jedes kade nenegin hat agi yat ho nada ha arle khwin zonje chon he yesa huijin khina neshadal enegin yego ban sida kes huije het ola dole het ola keda honit in kin manna hastan khajoba huil yad le oljeda dat enigido johna en jada yego jodo le noda edaban sa kesige hehen hidini do nidi shidet jigi Dr. Bunagr ninshia to yat en hidini do rodoshe belagani kitchen kitchen yeshkit do le. I just want to say good morning to each and every one of you. It's an honor to be here. As I mentioned in Navajo, I wanted to just say it's an honor to be in the presence of some of our most leaders throughout the world, throughout the country, and really the ones that really are thinking about the future. And that's one of in Navajo, you say Yedes Kand and Sahakes, which think for the future. And one of those principles that I've always used, being the leader of the Navajo Nation, I think for the locals, the Navajo Nation, as I looked at the square kilometers in similar size, it's about 69,000 square kilometers. kilometers, about the size of Tasmania. So I was trying to compare it because usually in the United States, I say we're about the size of West Virginia. And so we're about the size of Tasmania. And so that's how big the Navajo Nation is. We sit in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And we have a very distinct relationship with the United States government. A treaty was signed in 1868. And basically, the U.S. government and the Navajo Nation put their differences aside and stopped fighting each other and said, you know what, how do we go from here and build the economy and build our communities up, and let's move forward. And so that's one of the things that I'm always proud of, is that I represent the southwestern part of the United States. The language that I spoke earlier is the Navajo language. It's really known worldwide for its Navajo code talkers. Navajo people have, I haven't tasted lamb yet here in Australia, but I do need to taste some lamb. Navajo is also known for having lamb and wool and some of the best rugs in all of the world, woven rugs as well too, and silversmithing. But the reason why I'm here today, as I mentioned in Navajo too, is just to really have a strong dialogue so that we can continue to make sure that as professionals, as colleagues, and really in the exploration of how do we transcend so that we move our communities, move our nation forward with the different technologies that are developed. And I know that a year ago, one of the statements that I made was a really statement that my predecessor in the late 90s also made a statement that's saying that, you know what, I think that sending human remains to the moon was not right. And so about a year ago, that was the same sentiment that I sent to, at the time, Administrator Nelson and different parties as well, too. So to really continue to make sure that NASA honors their sentiments that they made to the Navajo Nation after various trips to the Navajo Nation, promising that they would consult the Navajo Nation if they would ever reconsider it. But 2 decades passed, and then we weren't consulted, and the mission still went forward. And obviously the mission wasn't successful, but in those relationships, really trying to make sure that my statement was that if I'm not against the Navajo Nation is no by means claiming the moon, or no by means trying to stop exploration, trying to stop the advancement of technology, but really, end of the day, it's like keep things that are sacred in terms of the moon. That's one of the most holiest deities, not only to the Navajo Nation, but to various tribes in North America as well, and probably the various indigenous nations throughout the world, and to really make sure that our voices are being heard wherever we are. And I was very fortunate that my voice was heard, and we were actually able to meet with representatives from the White House within the week, and met with Administrator Nelson at the time a few weeks later. But again, that's one of the things that I feel like is so important, is to see our local indigenous leaders, and that I know that they continue to fight and advocate for their voices to be heard. So I think some of you work for various governments throughout the world, and I think that it's okay to have as Shamasana in Navajo, that's grandma, and in a respectful way to mention, as Ren was mentioning earlier, just to make sure that we continue to respect those spaces and you have those tough discussions. Sometimes it's not a tough discussion, it's more of a discussion of what's really behind, why are we exploring, why are we trying to elevate the different realms of advancing our communities, advancing our technologies, because indigenous people, I don't think there's any one single indigenous people throughout the world that said we're never going to advance. I think that as you look back through history, you look at the Navajo Nation within itself, we're always constantly trying to advance ourselves. And since I was a kid, I always remember my grandma, my elders, they always look up at the stars and tell some of the seasons, and tell some of the weather, and tell some of the things that might come to fruition, or might help or be able to forecast. As a young kid, less than 10 years old, I never knew what they would talk about. But now that I reflect back on some of these spaces that I'm actually able to be a part of, it makes me think about my grandma, my elders, they never got any formal forms of education, but they knew the constellations, they knew the systems in the sky, and they were able to make their lives, and they based their lives on that. And so again, I think that's kind of my introductory remarks, but I'm just honored to be here on behalf of the 400,000 plus Navajo people throughout the world. And again, just an honor to be here. So thank you for allowing me to share a few words.
Yeah. Thank you, President Nygren. And on that note of working with the sacred, working with community, I think, Professor Danielle, you have a lot of experience trying to think about all these other factors that I think sometimes we don't always remember or place at the forefront when doing engineering or space science or all these complex projects. But I'd love to hear your perspective about all that, bringing that justice, that equity, kind of that way of thinking more holistically through the engineering practice.
Hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. I want to also acknowledge our hosts, the Gadigal people, and say a big thank you to the Australian Space Agency, to the whole local organizing committee, to all those who have played a role in selecting the plenaries. Thank you for allowing us to have this series of this host nation plenary and this additional plenary to discuss these important topics. I want to check with the audience and ask, how many of you identify as Indigenous who are here with us today? Will you raise your hand? It's so nice to see many of you up front. It's been nice spending the week with you. Thank you for being with us. I honor you as mentors to me. Thank you for allowing me to learn from you. How many of you then, raise your hand if you don't identify as Indigenous? All right, welcome. I'm here to speak especially to you. I'm somebody who also can raise my hand. I don't identify as Indigenous. Often I focus in my self-identification as somebody who's descended from the Atlantic slave trade. So my ancestors, the land that I can think closely about is in Georgia, where my great-grandfather sort of miraculously was able to maintain a large farm for his 13 children to inherit, at a time when many African-American people came out of slavery and were working as sharecroppers, and most were just cheated out of land that they worked hard. My family still has a farm in Georgia, and now that I'm in my 40s and my dad's getting older, I need to go and take charge and start paying the taxes and knowing exactly where this land is. But it's a part of my heritage. Also, I think we trace likely back to West Africa, where there's an even longer history. But of course, the violence of the story of slavery means I don't know exactly where in West Africa. It could also be Southern Africa. There are many slaves also traded from Angola, for example. So I have spent much of my adult life, since about age 17, asking what it means that I'm part of the diaspora of African ancestry people, and connecting also, of course, with my European ancestry. And maybe, we're not totally sure, I might also have some Native American ancestry. The stories in my family think that we do, but things are hard to prove. So instead, we just are very open to receiving blessings from our communities. As somebody who has somewhat of an ambiguous ancestry, I also then take opportunities to learn whenever I can. I want to appreciate a few people. Professor David Newman introduced me both to Dr. Alvin Harvey and Dr. Ren Freeman, and it started me on an important journey. And I want to recommend a book, especially for those of you who raised your hand that you don't identify as Indigenous. The book is called Decolonizing Design by Professor Elizabeth Tunstall. Professor Tunstall was known as becoming the first Black woman or Black person to be the dean of a major organization, in this case, an architectural and design graduate program in Ontario, Canada. And in learning about her experience, she wrote a book to reflect on her experience in this role. And when I heard about it, it had been published by the press at my university. She came in person to give a talk. And I knew that she had been successful in diversifying the faculty, increasing the number of people from different backgrounds who served as faculty. And she gave a talk talking about what allowed her to do that. And I was so surprised at what she said. And at the time, I was even very skeptical. But I'll tell you today, as you can see me sitting with these amazing leaders, you'll see that I've followed her footsteps. Because the first principle she mentioned that allowed her to guide her leadership as a dean, she called Indigenous first. Now, like me, she doesn't identify as Indigenous, but her leadership style she described as Indigenous first. And what she meant was this: In a very practical way, she invited and requested guidance and mentorship from local First Nations people. And she was working in a land that wasn't her own. She moved up to Ontario for this job, but she invites people from the communities to guide her as advisors. She formed a board of Indigenous and First Nations leaders to give her advice. And then she followed their concerns and their priorities in her leadership. And she also shared her own. She talked about her goals of inviting new faculty and serving the students. But she made sure to listen to their ideas first. And she talked about how that helped her both emotionally and mentally, just in terms of her well-being, having this supportive board, but also it allowed her to be successful in her goals. Now that I look at my life, I see that I start to follow this guide. And I want to appreciate Dr. Harvey because it started a bit when you joined my class a number of years ago, and you taught me the history that President Nygren just described, how in the 1990s, NASA landed a lander on the moon with the ashes of Eugene Shoemaker, the astronomer. I had never heard that story until you told me about it. And then it led to me learning with you and led to us having conversations, sometimes during COVID on virtual settings where Dr. Freeman came and talked with us on a webinar, and we started to ask, what are the things we can learn from Indigenous views on space? And eventually, seeing your letter again come out in the second attempt to land ashes on the moon, I've learned so much from each of you. And it's led to me also, in my practice, changing the way I collaborate. Part of what I do as a space engineer is work with leaders who invite me to join their communities on important efforts. This includes leaders in West Africa, places like Benin and Ghana, in Southern Africa, places like Angola, also in Puerto Rico, and lately also with the Yurok Native American tribe, which is the largest tribe in California, and with Navajo Nation. I'm often asking how we can design hands-on engineering projects that use space technology, if desired by the community, to address a local need. In this case, for example, I was recently very honored as part of a NASA-funded project to visit the land of the Yurok tribe. We were able to join them as they were flying their tribally operated plane, which they used to take measurements with a LiDAR system, a laser-based system to estimate the height of trees. And we're also joining them to add a satellite-based analysis. They're participating in the California Air Resources Board market for carbon credits. And they're earning money, which I think also is relevant to the Navajo Nation. They're earning money on forest that preserving as a way to bring income and to be able to keep reclaiming land. And we're supporting them with NASA-funded project to use satellite data to also confirm the process they're using to maintain their forest, to respond to fires, and to maintain the level of biomass that they want to prove so they can earn the funds for the carbon credits. I wonder if you've also heard about the story of the Klamath River. Has anyone heard anything important about the Klamath River lately? It's a nationally and internationally known story. It's really an example of what I'm starting to learn about, which is Indigenous sovereignty. There were 4 major dams on the Klamath River, and they were causing an obstruction for the important salmon species and many other biodiversity questions. And the Klamath is an important part, it's really the center of the land of the Yurok people. They spent decades advocating for the removal of 4 dams that were also power plants. And they were successful so that just in the last year, these 4 dams, huge concrete structures that were also power plants, were removed. I tell you the story about them just to say it's an internationally tracked story, but it means that they were able to identify this important question about how to maintain the health of the land and to fight for years to make this change in a very concrete way. And they also see space technology as one of the tools they can use both to reclaim colonized land, to help address biodiversity and reintroduce important species like the condor, as well as to ask what it means to live in harmony with the bears and the owls that they're maintaining a place for, along with the people. I'm so honored also to visit, in the past, Navajo Nation's land, particularly the Navajo Technical University. I can brag a bit on your behalf. NTU is particularly well-known technical university and the first to have an accredited engineering program, particularly in electrical engineering. And we collaborated with your university, asking how we could train youth in programming robots that operate on the space station. So we were able to first work with the university, who then worked with local elementary school programs and middle school programs. And we were teaching kids ages 11 to 15 how to write programming for robots. And we had a big session virtually across the country showing how these robots were programmed by your students, by Hopi and Zuni students, by students across the country. But they were on the space station, and we all got to watch it live together. So thank you for allowing me to visit and to be able to see this collaboration. These are very practical examples, and it also feeds into my other regional work, places like Puerto Rico and places in Africa where there's also questions of what sovereignty means. And I pick these lessons as I go. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Danielle. And on that note, President Nygren, I think our people come from some of the oldest engineers and scientists from the deserts and mountains of Turtle Island. And I know a lot of our colleagues and relatives here, there's a desire to want to do good in the world. There's a desire to want to help people. And I think there's this growing desire to want to work with tribal nations, indigenous knowledge systems. And I'd love to hear what you have in terms of experience or in terms of advice for our community here about, well, how do we go about doing that then? How do we go and work with tribal nations, do it respectfully, do it in a lot of the ways that Danielle is referencing? But from your perspective as a leader, what does that look like for you, for this community?
Thank you, Elvin. One of the first things I think about is knowing that it's okay to go visit some Native American communities or Indigenous communities or Aboriginal communities, because most of the time their hearts are always in the right place. And basically, you always go into any community that you work with, just make sure that your heart's in the right place and say, you know what, am I here to really ask the right questions? Am I here to try to advance humanity? Am I trying to advance and protect Mother Earth? Or what are some of the things that I want to ask Aboriginal or Native American or American Indian people throughout the world? And I think it just comes from there. Just make sure that your heart is right there. And I think probably 9.9 out of 10 times you'll be welcomed with open arms. And just really make sure that you have good dialogue and you listen. I think the main thing is do a lot of listening, and at the same time try to get adapted to the different cultural norms that are normal within, because like in America, there's 574 plus recognized tribes. Every one of them speaks a different language. Every one of them's got a different culture, and every single one of them is not the same. So what works for Navajo is not going to work for the rest of the 573 tribes throughout America. And so again, I think that's where just being able to take that holistic perspective and just to sit down and have a discussion. And I think that's where it all starts from. And I think that's the easiest thing to do. But as far as a leader and the way I've kind of gone about, as I mentioned in Navajo, I've been in office almost 3 years in January. So I've worked 2 years as Navajo Nation president with President Biden and his administration, and then working with the new administration over the past 9-10 months as well too. So I think that that's what I try to do too, as a Navajo Nation president, is because I represent the people, I represent the communities, and I try to make sure that I work with whoever is in office and to try to be as respectful as I can. In Navajo, they say use keh. Keh means relationships. You know what I mean? Everybody in this world, you don't have to be Navajo to be related. There's different ways of recognizing that. If they're an elder, if they're an older, they could be your parents' age, they could be an uncle, an aunt, or if they're younger than you, they could be your kid or young enough to be your kid, or in different types of relationships. And really using that type of methodology really has worked for me. I know that I'm in a unique position to where I get to meet with previous secretaries from the different administration to the new secretaries as well too, and to also meet with the previous president of the United States, and to be able to meet with the current president of the United States this year as well too. So, and I think that what has always worked for me is because just the way we're asking you to go into communities of Aboriginal nations or Native American communities or American Indian communities, using that same methodology, because I use that when I leave the Navajo Nation. I use that perspective of we're all one human being. It's just that the way the holy deities have talked to certain individuals or certain nations is just a little bit different. And so that would be my best advice, is that you use relationships and just be as respectful as you can, and know that whatever you're asking for, is it trying to in my case, I'm always thinking about how do I advance the communities of the Navajo Nation? Like, how do we get back to living 103 years old? How do we make sure that our communities are healthy? How do we make sure that our communities are active, and a lot of the things that hurt our communities and our people, we fight those off so that we can continue to thrive within the 4 sacred mountains. On Navajo, the Navajo Nation is surrounded by 4 sacred mountains, and that's where our culture and our way of life, we say that's where we've always been, time and time immemorial, is that this is where the Navajo people are from. They've emerged through different worlds to currently be in this world as well. And so when I think about those perspectives, is really just trying to make sure that you just be respectful, because I think that that's what I've tried to use as I leave the Navajo Nation, and it's worked well. And so that would be my advice, Alvin, is just use and everything tends to work out pretty good.
Our knowledges are so diverse, all of our people throughout the globe. But I think we all share, like Indigenous people, from my experience, this idea of relationality, of kinship, of being able to walk together with that type of diplomacy and understanding. And as I've traveled, different communities, and even elders from our community will tell me that the one thing that all of our Indigenous people share around the globe is the stars. It might be a different perspective from where we're from here, but it's always that connection that we've had with the stars going on since time immemorial. And I find that powerful because it also means that not only do we have shared stars, but we have shared principles. We might have a different word for wherever we travel, but it's a standard in which we can take as part of our science, as part of our understanding as we move forward. And that's part of our Indigenous knowledge systems. And in negotiating that area and bringing that Indigenous knowledge systems to science, to engineering, the sacred, the cultural, all these different aspects, fortunately, we do have a leading scholar in being able to move through that in negotiating the sacred, as you say, as going through Indigenous research methodologies and methods. Seren, please, if you have any advice for our very diverse community here about what it means to work with Indigenous people and with Indigenous knowledge systems.
Rako, everyone. I think when we visit like this, we formulate pictures in our mind, and we start understanding what I call as, how do we define respect? What is relationship? And this is such a wonderful example of a relationship. So we've all come together to understand what is space and what is the relationship with Earth. And if you consider, we human beings, we create a relationship that is visible and revealed through our cultures. So, in certain ways across the world, we can say that our cultures reflect our knowledge relationships. It's the environment that we are in, where we come from, that helps craft our worldviews, how we look out at the world and at each other. And that includes the sky, the knowledge from the sky. And when I was told the story of this amazing gift, this memory tool, academically we call it a mnemonic partner, helps us remember, helps us to think about the stories that have come before, helps us to remember where we are today, and it helps us to think about tomorrow. So in that respect, don't we embody past, present, and future in that remembrance? And I think that's so important to understanding what is knowledge. And I think in that way, that's a place that we all can begin to talk to each other. What do we bring together? How do we, again, define space? It's about creating that mutual center, that place and the spaces within it. And on this wonderful tool, and my people work with a similar friend and partner, a talking stick. I inherited one from my dad, and over the years, I've been gifted with several, and they remind me of conversations that need to be had because they were once conversations that connected us. And I think that in this way, then, we always have present the memories if we'll look to them and understand them in terms of, okay, today, how can we celebrate what good has happened? So that's what I call good ways of being, good ways of knowing. And that can help us to do good. But we have to define that together and within context. So here's this context. We're all here for various reasons connected around the theme of this gathering. And what do we bring with it from ourselves, our own thinking? And we pull that together and we learn, right? We're learning. We should walk away from here more knowledgeable and also with space inside our hearts, spirits, our minds. How can we live that new knowledge then that helps all of us? How do we create those places of benefit? And when we create what you said yesterday, why do we look to the stars? Maybe we're looking for that kinship. Our peoples are star people. We know that relationship. We have our stories. Here in this land, in your country, I feel is the greatest example of that relationship. I first came here in 2015 and have been back several times working with people and learning about your land and your ways of seeing yourselves and your peoples and the sky and how you can see that in your land. And that's where you are every day. I learned so much about that. And I turned and I said, my people have similarities in that. And then I began looking across the world as I traveled. We share that, We share that if we'll let ourselves be in that place of remembrance, of a return. If we invite these places that I call this space of unknowing, we let ourselves learn. And then how does that help us to be home in ourselves and with each other? So I think that's what I've learned. That's what I like to share is our connections, but then also what is the differences that we can celebrate. So let's not approach any of this as a problem to be solved, but what have we done right? Let's start there and let's celebrate there. I think that helps us then to understand what is our next work. What should we be paying attention to? And I heard that and learned that from our friends who've been our hosts. And that means we're connected. We have something to talk about. So that's what I've learned. And we get that from understanding the sources of our knowledge that craft our cultures, our languages. That's what they teach us. We interpret that as human beings. And then we live that. So that's what I've learned. And this is such a beautiful example of that connection between sky, knowledge, and beings and ancestors, and our beautiful turtle, our beautiful planet that we're here. But as Danielle said, Alvin and I have worked together. This is our 5th year of working together and sharing and learning. And we ask so many questions, and we've worked with a lot of people and traveled, and we're always talking about what does that mean then to be Indigenous off Earth? Well, we have to think about then, as I said earlier, what does that even mean, Indigenous? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And that's a persistent question as we travel and we go through time and we visit you, learning. maybe that's a place. That's a beginning too, is that kinship, wanting to feel that and work in it, live in it. And we know that from our knowledges, because it's there. That knowledge doesn't need us. We need that knowledge and how we create relationship. Relationality with that knowledge is key. So that's what I learned. Thank you for asking me to share that. And I
Absolutely.
reflect that here.
Yes, yes. I think you mentioned that talk yesterday, and I think that idea of how we purpose ourselves, at least how I purpose myself in Indigenous knowledge systems or doing Indigenous science, is always in this pursuit of wanting to learn how to be a good relative. And I opened up this talk about setting our intention when we're doing engineering, when we're doing science, when we're having these conversations. It's how do we move forward, not just seeking knowledge for the sake of seeking and building knowledge, but really seeking and building knowledge to learn how to continuously be a good relative. And the universe is moving all the time, right? Knowledge is changing, our experiences are changing. So that just asks us to keep with it, keep going. There is no, one solution and we stop there. There's always going to be a continuous process of learning, of engineering and building. And the process of working with Indigenous communities isn't just a one solution type of thing. It's actually a whole process. And I think I'd love to hear your experiences with that, Danielle, and even parallels working with other nations, even in Africa, is that process of continually going and going and going with it.
Right here on the stick is a reminder of the Milky Way. And the Emu is there as one of the dark sky constellations. I recall the first time I saw the Milky Way with my own eyes. It was in the country of Kenya. I don't think I'm from Kenyan origin, but I traveled there at age 19, my first trip to Africa. I was just seeking connections with this broader community of people of African descent, and I worked at a school for girls. And I had never realized how close the Milky Way is. Growing up in Florida, I had never seen so many stars at once with my own eyes. I remember I felt a little scared. I almost felt like the sky was falling toward me. I kind of crouched down when I saw how bright the Milky Way was. But it was a powerful connection to realize I'm part of this amazing, beautiful stream. And seeing here now, it is indeed a mnemonic device. It's a memory aid for me. I wrote an essay called The Expanding Sphere of Human Responsibility on Earth and in Space. And it asks a lot of questions around the role of humans as we continue to engage with our planet Earth and with places beyond, the area for orbiting right around the Earth, the space that's part of the Earth-Moon system, we often call it cislunar space, the orbit of the moon's surface, going beyond. Humans now have more regular interaction with other planets, like Venus and Mars, our closest neighbors, but also the moons of smaller planets, larger planets like the moons of Saturn or Jupiter. We're able to send our robots there, and we're able to have impact on these places. Some, like Mars, are places where there may still be opportunity to prove the existence of life as we know it, maybe in fossil form, maybe in microscopic form. And we have so many important questions. And I think this generation is going to face really urgent questions of how to behave as a human species with all these different backgrounds. Recalling what I mentioned, and I still want to remind you all, check out the book, Decolonizing Design of Professor Tunstall, and learn about this idea of Indigenous first. As humans are exploring these places, trying to care for our planet here, for the orbit around the Earth, for the space between here and the moon, for the moon itself, for places like Mars, for small celestial bodies. In each of these zones, I'm eager to hear and to learn from Indigenous ways of being and caring, because I think we'll need them to do things in the right way in going forward. There are vital and critical decisions that will be made by humans in the next few years. It's already happening, places like the moon where we can reach more easily. And we want to take all the question of how do we care for a place like Mars. Let us not accidentally erase the record of past life if it's there. But how do we behave also if we are going to have humans living in places like Mars? How do we treat small celestial bodies like asteroids as resources, but also as these beautiful, special cosmic relatives. I think we can learn so much about how to do these practical things. So I have challenges for each of you to consider. It's to educate yourself, find out about the questions and the opportunities where Indigenous leaders are exercising sovereignty, and learn how you can support and take a lesson. This could mean learning about a discussion or a debate that might be happening, as an Indigenous group might be protesting or otherwise pointing out a need for coordination on things like the siting of astronomical facilities, or on the care for the dark sky as more and more satellites are operated. You'll find that my friends here are doing a lot of advocacy because they need to communicate the importance of keeping our view of the sky even as more satellites are operating. I think you spent some time with the SATCON committees, right, with NSF, asking what does it mean to have both astronomical perspectives but also perspectives from communities about the importance of the dark sky. It also means asking what Indigenous data sovereignty means. So as I work with the Yurok Nation and sometimes with Navajo Nation to think about using satellite data to make maps, there's a form I have to fill out. It's required by NASA with NASA grants. It's called the Data Management Plan. This is just the everyday stuff, guys. It's not theoretical. And the Data Management Plan from NASA usually says, thou shalt release all data publicly at the end of the project. And whenever I do a project with Yurok Tribe, for example, I write, no, there's actually a clause that also says, I won't release everything unless the Yurok Tribe gives me permission. So even though, of course, we do believe in open data and sharing and scientific results, but the important thing is to ask in this land where I'm working with the tribal leadership, what do they want to release? And is there anything they prefer not to release? And to actually literally put settings on our software that gives them control over what we share and then reduces my influence on what's shared. There are important types of knowledge that are not for everyone, and this is what I've learned about how to practice data sovereignty in my projects. Even if we're using NASA data, there's locally known knowledge that can be incorporated with it that I'm not in control of, but they are. There's also other very practical questions, like the example I gave with the Klamath River and the removal of the dam, biodiversity and just the broader care for our relatives, the rivers and the land, the trees. There are those who have such knowledge, and often, you mentioned all the languages, that knowledge may be encoded in languages that are being lost. It's been my privilege to listen to different stories around the fight to maintain language, such that we also can, of course, celebrate it in itself, but also there's ecological knowledge in languages that are under threat. So if we lose Indigenous languages, whether it's in the US context, in places like Scandinavia, we'll lose clues about how our Earth actually works. So you might be contributing in some way to the efforts of Indigenous leaders to teach the next generation their language, if you can donate or otherwise support people. These are all practical things you can do because we have vital decisions to make as a species, but in Indigenous first sense, we need to support our Indigenous leaders who are going to help us do things in a good way. So these are very practical examples. Think about data sovereignty. Think about what it means to support Indigenous caretakers of biodiversity. Think about language and other ways to maintain culture. And think about being a good guest. I appreciate your comment that it's okay to visit, because sometimes we can feel nervous if we're not sure how to visit a community. And often there are public events. For example, I live in Massachusetts, and I'm often able to visit the Mashpee Wampanoag people. They have public powwows. You can go online and buy a ticket. It's not something that requires even knowing anybody there. You can pay $15 and you can go and have some fry bread. And these are very practical ways to honor the people of that land. And then I learned about their deep ties between both Massachusetts, where I live, and the Caribbean, and the fact that there are people of all different colors, including mine, that are part of this tribal community. And they celebrate with their dances and their medicine, and they allow me to be a guest there and learn from them. So it's amazing that you can take these practical steps as a visitor, someone learning about how to practice data sovereignty in support of your Indigenous collaborators, learning about debates and important protests that happen, as well as supporting efforts at language and biodiversity restoration. So thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. I really appreciate putting it in the practical sense and showing that there's concrete examples about how to go about doing this partnership. And continuing this partnership and continuing the stream of knowledge and experience, I just want to give a few more minutes before we close out to President Nygren, and just speaking directly to our Indigenous relatives out there that are here today or maybe calling in, listening in, just to be able to talk to them about what it means to advocate and speak, as Indigenous nations and as really star people and star nations as well. So, it's back over.
Yeah. So biga means okay. So can I get a biga? Yeah. All right, biga. So one time I was visiting. I was at the American Public Power Association event down in New Orleans. And I was basically, I'm getting that, you can learn another word. So we were going to get some pastries, and the pastries place was a beignet. And I was like, beignet? I'm like, is that a Navajo place? I'm like, is that beignet? Because a beignet means with purpose. And so, can I get a beignet?
Yeah.
All right, so that's so just do everything with purpose. And so one of the things I think about is, back to your question, Alvin, is just how do you get involved, and how do you make sure that as a tribal nation, as a tribal leader, and so having been this has been my first public office, is just being open-minded. So I always try to encourage Indigenous leaders, Indigenous advocates that learn how to listen, learn how to hear the other people's perspectives, because sometimes we can get so caught up in not listening. And here, as Indigenous people or Indigenous relatives, we're always asking people to listen, but sometimes when people present to us, we don't want to listen. And so how can we expect them to listen to us if we're not willing to listen? And so that's one of the things I try to practice as the president of the Navajo Nation is when I meet with different organizations, different entities, or different enterprises throughout that want to work with Navajo or want to partner with Navajo, I always try to know that their hearts are probably in the right place. Let me open up my heart, let me open up my mind, and let me see how we can possibly work together. And I think that's an advice that I want to give all of our tribal leaders, is that listen, because if they're coming out to come see you, they probably thought a lot about it, and they probably really thought to themselves, no, this is not going to work. Why am I going to this tribal nation? Why am I going to this tribal leader? I'm probably going to get shut down. Why should I go there? But if they're actually at your footsteps, they've knocked on the door, they've bought the powwow ticket, and they got some fire bread in some hand, and their hearts are probably in the right place. So sit down and listen to them and hear them out. And so that would be my advice. And I think the other thing I think about too is, I think to all of our partners here too is, I think I know we're giving you a few perspectives here today, but one of the things I would encourage is hire Indigenous people within your organizations. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be very powerful, because I remember when I used to, my background is construction management. And so when I ended up working for a construction company, I was able to educate my colleagues for the 8 years that I worked for that organization. And they learned a lot about who Navajo people are, who Indigenous people are, American Indian people are. And then in a roundabout way, I kind of fulfilled a lot of the gaps that were misconceptions. So again, I think organizations that are here, visit your local colleges, local universities, and really try to even possibly bring on a mentor. I know sometimes that we're always looking for our Indigenous people to be engineers, whether it's Aboriginal or Native American or American Indian, is that we really need more engineers out there, because I really believe that engineers are very solution-oriented type of people, and that the people that are here today at this week at this conference, they're not really here to complain about not solving a problem. They're just here to figure out, how do we resolve a problem? How do we try until we figure it out? Kind of a mentality. So that's what I'm excited about being here this week, is that you try to adapt other Indigenous people and Aboriginal people to come work for your organization. And then the other thing, I think, just to close on my end, is I was told that when I've met with various officials, one of them, they used to say, a long time ago, they would use the Navajo landscape to simulate Mars. And so within the areas of the Navajo Nation, so they would actually test a lot of their equipment to use some of the landscapes that are within the Navajo Nation. And so that's one of the things I think about, is back to how tribal nations and tribal communities try to partner together, try to work together, and at the same time really try to figure out, how do we protect Mother Earth. And Navajo and Nihima Nahastan, that's what we call Earth, is Nihima, means our mother. Nahastan is the one that gives us everything that we could possibly ever want. and we got to continue to always protect that. And then the sun, right, and that's the one that provides from the outside, and he gives us everything that we could possibly need here on earth. And again, I think those concepts and those words have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, well before the sun was studied, well before the earth was scientifically studied. So I think that sometimes we tend to look past our mom, look past our fathers, and sometimes we don't try to expand on some of the knowledges that have already been provided to us. And so I think that's one of the things I continue to urge our friends and our relatives that are here today, is that thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to us as community advocates, as tribal leaders, and really wishing you all the best, that you continue to make your communities proud and figure out how do we continue to exist into the future very healthy, and we continue to take care of what we have today, which is where we live as well too. So with that, I want to say thank you. I really appreciate you all being here, and I can't say any more. So in Navajo, it's thank you. And then there's in Navajo, there's no goodbye too. So it's hagonet, just means see you later. And so hagonet.
Hagonet. In that spirit, we'll keep this conversation going. And, this is a time in which we keep it going with our messenger relative here too. So if I can ask Dean, who passed this to me on Monday, I want to pass it back to him, carrying this good medicine, carrying this good knowledge from my three amazing guests, amazing scholars, engineers, scientists. And I want to offer this back to Latani Dean. His gratitude and thank you, and for everything that will continue on, just the beginning here. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again. We hope to be back. We hope to have a Navajo Nation Space Agency. We hope to have IAC welcome us back, maybe an Indigenous session one of these days as well. So gratitude, thank you. And if you get a chance, go and thank the water, thank the sky out there, and just remember that connection to the stars that we all share and that we should all protect as well. So, we'll see you again.